Let's go to Singapore and speak to Adam Hancock. Adam, what are the most significant restrictions, the latest that are being loosened?
Well, I think the biggest change that will impact people's lives in terms of restrictions is testing and the requirements for testing. You obviously referenced it there, but these testing booths that are everywhere across China, people have to queue up on an almost daily basis to get PCR tests so they can get a negative result and therefore gain access to public areas. A lot of these booths now, we hear reports, some of them are starting to be removed. We've seen videos in Beijing, a couple of them being removed. And that indicates that there's going to be less requirement for negative tests or proof of a negative test to get into public venues, get into the metro. We heard in Shenzhen that commuters would no longer require a negative test to get onto the metro just to get to work. And I think that's going to be a big change for people who are so used to now queuing up every few days to get these tests. In terms of other changes to restrictions, well, there were reports that there's going to be a different way that people who actually catch the virus are going to be quarantined now. So far in China, under the zero COVID strategy, everybody who tests positive has been taken away to centralized quarantine centers or hospitals, and even contacts and close contacts have been treated the same way. But we understand that soon that is going to change and people are going to start to be allowed to quarantine at home. That's the case for people who've got the virus as well as contacts. So that will also make a huge difference as well, because many people in China have been living in fear of getting taken away to these quarantine centers for 7 or 10 days, very basic facilities, very concerning. Some people saying they're more concerned about going to spend time at a quarantine center than actually catching the virus itself. So it does seem that testing and quarantine requirements are going to be two of the big changes. And remember, there were a number of changes announced even before these protests in terms of how contacts are handled and also quarantine requirements when entering the country. So slowly but surely, some of these restrictions are starting to loosen. It's going at different paces in different cities. There's not one centralized way of doing things so far, but it does seem that COVID requirements are going to change in China in the coming weeks.
The whole world has seen the social impact that zero COVID has had on China. Of course, the financial impact has been immense as well, with China's economy, the world's second biggest, suffering. In terms of the medical impact, Adam, when you look at the official figures, China, in terms of being the biggest country in the world population-wise, per capita, has not suffered as much in terms of COVID infections and COVID deaths. So could this be now the moment that zero COVID begins to be phased out?
It's certainly starting to look that way, and I think phased is the key point there. I don't think this is going to be fast. I think this is going to be a very slow process. I mean, if you're looking for indications, the Formula One race in Shanghai taking place in April next year, that was cancelled yesterday. So it certainly doesn't look like life is going to be completely back to normal anytime soon. But I think the shift in mentality and the shift in statements coming from officials really shows that there's a change of tone in the way that people in China at a higher level are starting to talk about COVID. There was reports of President Xi in his meeting with EU officials saying that the Omicron variant is much weaker, which is obviously a big statement for him to make when so long officials in China have talked about how dangerous COVID is, how deadly it is. We've seen reports in state media talking about how people shouldn't be panicking about newer variants of COVID. So it does seem that the tone is starting to shift. But remember, even with these changes that I was just discussing, if you implement them, China still has some of the strictest COVID restrictions in the world. And there's a whole mentality around COVID because people have spent 3 years living like this. So there's a lot of mindset to change before big changes can take place. And health officials in China, they know that there's low vaccination rates amongst elderly people. There's concerns about the vaccines that are being used and how they will stand up against COVID. And there's concerns from a public health standpoint. If they do loosen COVID zero and let the virus spread through the country, or is the hospital system going to be able to cope, particularly in more remote areas of China where the facilities won't be up to standard? So I think we're seeing a gradual shift. I don't think it's going to be anything like the kind of Freedom Day that we saw in the UK, where one day suddenly the restrictions are all eased. I think it's going to be a very measured approach, and perhaps we'll be in and out of lockdown depending on hospital rates and ICU capacity. But I think slowly but surely the tone is starting to shift in China.
May not be a bad idea not to have the sort of Freedom Day that the UK had. Adam, a few thousand people at least died after that so-called Freedom Day in the United Kingdom. Thank you so much indeed, Adam Hancock in Singapore.